Welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi. My name is James.
And my name is Matt.
And today's episode, we are looking at romance in time travel films. So this has been a topic which we've been discussing sort of throughout this series. It's come up a few times, hasn't it, Matt?
Yeah, we've looked at various different time travelers and the slightly weird relationships they tend to have with their other halves. So it's good to do a whole episode focusing on that to see really what we think of that, because we've only had a chance to touch on it briefly when we've been talking about other subjects.
So recently we've looked at different genres specifically. We looked at sort of like time travel and horror films, time travel and comedy. And this week we're sort of taking a little bit of a look at time travel and romance movies.
Yeah, mostly led by Rachel McAdams, who features in the first of our films that we'll be looking at today. So what are the two films that we picked out to look at romance, James?
So the two films we'll be looking at and discussing are The Time Traveler's Wife from 2009 and, excitingly, we're finally going to get to finish the trilogy that is Back to the Future. We're going to be talking about Back to the Future Part 3 from 1990.
Yeah, we had to finish off the trilogy this series, didn't we, James? We had to get the third part in and go to the Old West with Marty and the Doc.
It had to be done. And we'll see just how wholesome that sort of love story in there actually is when we sort of discuss that film.
But before that, let's get started with The Time Traveler's Wife.
I've known Henry since I was 6 years old. I remember the first day we met.
Travel through time. In fact, you and I are friends in the future, when you're a lady.
There's no such thing as time travelers.
Well, if you hang around long enough, you'll see me disappear.
1 second he was there, and the next, he was gone. I've been waiting for Henry my entire life.
It's you. I wrote down every time that you came to visit me. You told me that you go back to the same places a lot.
Yeah, it's like gravity. Big events pull you in.
I was a big event.
So The Time Traveler's Wife then, Matt. Had you seen this film before?
No, I hadn't seen it. And I remember when it came out and I did quite want to see it, but it got fairly slated by the critics, didn't it?
Yeah, it was an interesting one because I was reading up about it before we looked at it. This week. And so Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston had bought the film rights for this book as soon as it came out. They went straight in and bought it. And if you look in the credits, Brad Pitt is executive producer on this, which I found really interesting. But the book did really, really well. It was like a interesting sort of merging of science fiction and romance, and people loved the book. So it's no wonder that people wanted to buy the film rights and sort of like get that made. But yeah, you're right. It did have like very mixed reviews when it actually came out. And we'll get into probably why we think it had those mixed reviews as we go on. Do you remember anything else about sort of when it came out?
I just thought it was an interesting concept, that it was a romance film about a guy who's unstuck in time and just kind of like floating through his own timeline, and the relationship that he has. I thought that was a pretty good concept. It turns out that the overall concept is one of the biggest kind of problems with the film and probably why it wasn't so well received. But it does deliver its central premise, which is a romance story between a woman who is traveling in one direction through time linearly and a man who is jumping about through time and not experiencing time in a linear fashion.
Yeah, and when we sort of doing the prep for this particular episode, we had a big debate about which films we should talk about in regards to sort of romance and time travel, because we were looking through them and there's loads, aren't there? There's loads of this sort of like mishmash of time travel and romance. So just to list off a few, we looked at sort of like potentially doing Midnight in Paris. There was About Time. So just those two there both star Rachel McAdams, which is another interesting thing. We also looked at potentially Somewhere in Time, Happy Accidents, all of these films which are centered around a romance and time travelers. So the fact that Rachel McAdams was in a bunch of these as well was another interesting thing. So she's been in like 4 time travel films, I think. So it was About Time, Midnight in Paris, Time Traveler's Wife, and Doctor Strange. So in all of those films, she's dealing with a time traveler and she doesn't get to time travel herself. Do you think that's like she's had a bit of a raw deal with that?
I think we're just waiting. There's a long-awaited film to be made, isn't there, where Rachel McAdams gets to be some kind of time traveler, whether it's in a romantic film or maybe she could be a time-traveling Marvel hero if she gets some kind of superpowers from Doctor Strange. There's got to be some kind of role. She's clearly, she's experienced as an actress. She knows what to do in a time travel movie. She can play that role. She just needs to flip it around. I'd love to see her on the other side of it.
And it's like it's funny that they keep going back to Rachel McAdams. Like she is like the ultimate woman for time travelers, it seems.
I guess so. Yeah, I don't know. She's is she box office gold for time travel movies? Is that what they're banking on?
I mean, it's got to be something like that. I mean, she's good in like a sort of like a romance-led film. The Notebook. She's got her credentials when it comes to this kind of film, hasn't she?
Yeah, she is a good actress. I really like her. I like her in this, even though it's maybe not the best film ever, but she is good in it.
Yeah, I thought she was great in the Eurovision film as well, actually. I think that's quite underrated. I thought that was hilarious. Some people disagree, but I wholeheartedly loved that film, and I thought Rachel McAdams was brilliant in it.
Really? All right, okay. I couldn't get past 10 minutes of that, so I can't... But I can't really give it full judgment for that reason.
Oh, Matt, seriously, there's some classic songs in there. Ya Ya Ding Dong is an absolute banger.
Okay.
Anyway, back to time travel and back to the time traveler's wife. So how does time travel work in this film? So you mentioned that the lead character Henry is going through time and experiencing this weird sort of time travel thing. How does that actually happen in the film?
It seems most similar to the butterfly effect, and later in the film it's explained as a genetic problem with Henry, which is even closer to the butterfly effect, because that's the situation there. It's inherited for Evan. And it seems pretty similar in this, doesn't it? That he's just randomly and without much control over it, unlike Evan, who gets control of it in the butterfly effect. Henry in The Time Traveler's Wife just disappears from wherever he is and pops up naked in some other time, and he doesn't know where, doesn't know when, and yeah, he just sort of appears there for a limited time, but he doesn't know how long it's going to be.
Yeah, it's a weird sort of setup for his time travel as well. So he sort of does a bit of a Terminator thing. He turns up naked, like you said. His clothes don't travel back in time with him, and he's instantly put in this sort of quite dangerous position. Whenever he pops back up in time, he doesn't know, like you said, he doesn't know where he's going to be, doesn't know how long it's going to be. And the first thing he always has to do is find some clothes and sort of blend in. So he's constantly just running around naked in this film, trying to sort of not be caught out.
Yeah, I have to say, I really did laugh when I realized that was what was going to be happening every time he travels in time, because we should say that part of the reason that we picked this film was that there's an air of creepiness about the premise of the film, which is that the time traveler meets his wife as a very young girl. She's like 6 or something, and has this ongoing friendship with her as a little girl before they become a romantic couple later. But obviously he knows her as a romantic partner. It's very strange. And there's, we're going to talk a lot more about that. And I knew that going in, and that was part of the reason we picked it, because we've seen so many creepy time travel relationships that it would be interesting to talk about this, very creepy time travel relationship. But yeah, I just laughed when I realized that he was going to be naked every time, because it's like, as if this premise isn't creepy enough, he's also going to be showing up naked every time he meets this little girl. It's just like, it couldn't get any worse. He's hiding in a bush naked the first time he goes back to her.
When I saw that scene, that's the first thing I wrote on my notes. I was like, creepy naked guy in a bush talking to a little girl. Is this really wrong?
Yeah.
And I mean, of course it's wrong. Yeah. Like, what is going on?
And he tells her, no, you cannot tell your mum.
Oh, it's so ridiculous. And it's sort of like he's doing the typical time traveler thing, like, oh, I'm a time traveler. I'm from the future, blah, blah, blah. You can't tell anyone. And he just sounds like a creepy naked guy trying to make excuses for talking to a little girl. And that scene is just, I think that's the creepiest bit in the film. That whole bit, yeah.
Yeah, that's the main problem with it. And we've looked at romance or romantic elements in other time travel films. There's a whole host of weird stuff with Marty McFly and his mum when he goes back to 1955 in Back to the Future. We looked at the time loop films where Bill Murray and Tom Cruise in Groundhog Day and Edge of Tomorrow, they develop this crush basically on a woman who doesn't know them from Adam every time the loop happens, but they fall in love, and there's a bit of creepiness there, and they can use their time travel abilities to sort of negotiate their way into this woman's heart. And yeah, I feel like The Time Traveler's Wife just ramps that creepiness up to 1,000,000 by having our time traveler go back and charm a little girl, if that's what's happening, befriend a little girl who he knows that he will go on to marry. It just feels incredibly wrong on every level, doesn't it?
Maybe I should call my mom.
No. Don't call your mom, please. Just hand me the blanket, and I'll leave. I come from the future. And when I do, I don't get to bring my clothes.
There's no such thing as time travelers.
Yes, there is. In fact, you and I are friends in the future. When you're a lady.
Am I pretty?
Yes. Very.
There's a bit of a mismatch there. I mean, that's probably the nicest way of saying it. The author of the book originally wrote it as a metaphor for her failed relationships. So she sort of like used this time travel theme to explore that. And sort of like, I don't know how much of that there is in there and sort of like how effective it is. Like, I was a bit sort of like torn between this whole thing, because obviously you can see it sort of like it's exploring the sort of miscommunication and distance in relationships and that kind of thing. How do you think the time travel worked in that respect? Is it sort of like creating an effective metaphor to talk about those things?
I mean, not really for me. That comes into the film about halfway through. After they get married in linear time. They meet, they go out, although Claire's got these memories of him before he's got any memories of her, because she's known him since she was a little girl, which for him hasn't happened yet. But they meet, they go out, they get married, and then there's like a montage of the problems kind of starting in the relationship, because he disappears. He literally disappears for, it can be weeks at a time, and she has no idea if he's coming back. So that's where you're getting this metaphor for like a difficult relationship where one of the partners just randomly disappears and is not there to communicate with the other person. So I completely understand that as a concept. It's just that in the film it doesn't happen till the halfway point, and it doesn't last for very long. And then he just goes and buys a lottery ticket and wins them $5 million and fixes everything. And so whatever message they were trying to go for there, it doesn't last very long, and it's solved by $5 million.
Yeah. I can see it. Like, I still find it quite interesting, that sort of like that way of looking at it from that sort of relationship angle. And I do think it's a really good idea. I don't know if it's more effective in the book. We say this with a lot of films that are based on books. Unless we read the books, we don't want to sort of judge the books as we judge the films. But purely based on this, like you said, it's sort of like it goes over it really quickly. And I sort of wanted to see more of that, because I quite like the idea of this sort of like time travel as being a metaphor for like a long distance relationship, because it is the longest distance. Like, if they're physically not even in the same time, you can do a lot of interesting things with that. But yeah, like you said, he buys the lottery ticket, and he's like, oh, I know it's hard, but here's loads of money. So maybe we can get over this hurdle in our relationship by just throwing money at it.
I guess. Do you think that's what they were going for? That it was like a metaphor for that? But it did seem like they were genuinely happy. They buy this fantastic house, and he knows that it's the perfect house because he's been to the future, and he knows that she loves it. And they do just seem genuinely happy after that point. Whereas, in real life, if there are problems in your relationship and you try and just throw money at it, that's more likely than not going to help things, is it?
And it's the sort of like also the idea that, so we talked about this quite a lot as well, the fact that if you've got future information about stuff and how you use that in the present when you're sort of like a time traveler. So there's a weird thing with this film. So Rachel McAdams knows Eric Bana before like he knows her. So her character has had all these years of building up that relationship with him, and he just has no idea when they first meet.
I'm sorry. I really have no idea who you are.
Look, I know how odd this must be for you. It's odd for me. But, would you like to have dinner with me? And I'll explain. Henry, we've been planning this dinner for a long time.
But yeah, so how did you feel about that sort of like their first moment and that idea that so Claire knows more about Henry than Henry knows about himself at that point?
Yeah, I just think it kind of it took a lot of the romance out of it, and it feels like the whole story would be better if there wasn't the pre-existing relationship between them before they meet in linear time, in Henry's linear time, because like they don't fall in love like a couple falls in love. She's already in love with him, and she just kind of like takes the lead and forces this relationship into existence because she knows this guy so well already. And then on top of that, you've got the creepiness of Henry going back and meeting her as a little girl. Both of those two things are kind of separate and bad for the film. And I do just think that there could have been a much better romantic story with a time traveler where the characters meet in a more normal, less creepy way, and you can still go through all the drama, like he's disappearing, and then he can still meet her at different points in the timeline, but it would just be less creepy if those points were after, you know, they've met, so after she's an adult. And yeah, and then it's just like not a natural sort of romantic meeting for the two of them. And it kind of took out some of the tension that you want in like a romantic comedy. Like there's a scene where he goes and reads her diary without her permission because he wants to see the exact dates that he's going to go back and meet her, because that'll help him navigate stuff, which is, you know, that happens in other like rom-coms, a breach of someone's trust, an invasion of privacy. And then normally in this kind of a film, you would expect there to be a big argument and then they have to like come back together and work it out together. But because she's got this, she's completely in love with him because she's known him all her life, she just forgives him. She's just like, I forgive you, don't worry about it. And it cuts out some of that tension that you would expect from a romantic film in the early stages of it, because she's completely bought into this relationship and he's happy to meet someone who understands his, you know, his problems.
And the way they sort of like set up the idea of the time travel and the fact that Henry can't change things, they tell you that like right at the start. He goes back to like certain moments which he gravitates to certain people, doesn't he, and certain things in his past or in other people's past. So that's why he keeps going back to sort of like Claire's past and seeing her as a kid, because he's got that intense relationship with her. But the sort of like the free will aspect of their relationship is a really tricky one, because neither of them really have much say in it. So as soon as Henry meets Claire, he's told, oh, we've known each other for years. You've sort of like been visiting me since I was a little girl. So he already knows that they've built up that relationship. So he doesn't have a say in building up that relationship. It's already there. And the same for Claire. She's almost groomed by Henry, which is really like dodgy, because he's setting himself up as this, I think she refers to him as this sort of like older worldly person in her life. And she sort of like develops this crush on him from seeing him again and again. And sort of like he helps with that. So neither of them are having a say in this relationship. They're kind of forced into it, which I think sort of takes away from that. The romance element of it is usually in a romance film, it's they meet, they fall in love, and that's sort of like where it all happens. Then you get the highs and the lows. But with this, it's already all determined. They already have to do it, but they're just doing it all out of sequence, and neither of them really get a say in it.
Yeah, so we've got another predestination paradox again, haven't we? But it's a predestination paradox built around a romantic relationship. Each character falls in love with the other character because that character was already in love with them when they met. So they have this affection towards each other that is there and one-sided for both of them. When they meet each other for the first time, they've already had a meeting on the other end where the other person had feelings for them and was affectionate towards them. It's creepy on the one end because on the one end it's a little girl, but it's the sort of same thing where the two characters meet and one of them is already having all of those feelings for the other character because of the time looping. I get it does somewhat absolve Henry of the guilt of the creepiness of what he's doing. I'm not saying that that's what I feel, but I think that's the sort of purpose it serves in the narrative, is that it's there to make you feel a little bit not quite so uneasy about him going and meeting this little girl, because you're kind of accepting that it's all just predetermined. I think that's what the purpose it's serving to the story.
Claire, right?
Yeah.
Could we pretend just for a minute that this is the first time we've met?
Okay. Sure. It's just that you're my best friend. I've been in love with you all my life.
And I mean, I tried to watch About Time as well before we did this episode, like another one with Rachel McAdams and time travel involved, just to sort of like see if they did things slightly differently in that. And again, it's kind of like the male characters do still seem creepy again, because in that film, it's a Richard Curtis film, and you've got the lead guy traveling back to try and make sure that his dates with Rachel McAdams go exactly how they should go. And if they go and they turn out like he wants them to, like he ends up getting her and then marrying her and so on and so forth. So again, it's this kind of like creepy male approach to romance where they're sort of like going back and they're making sure that things are exactly how they want them to be, so they can eventually get to sleep with that woman and then sort of build up that relationship. And it's like in Groundhog Day, we had that debate when we were talking about that film, how Bill Murray is sort of like, it isn't until Bill Murray sort of like realizes he's a bit of an arsehole that he sort of like changes his approach and stops trying to be so like, I've got to get this date right, I've got to do this, I've got to do that, and just looks inwardly, that he kind of gets that change. So it's interesting with this, because with this film, then they're sort of like, they are changing each other in their relationship, but it's sort of like it's forced again, isn't it?
Yeah, but there is a degree of balance, because they both meet each other with that degree of foreknowledge, and I think that's what we've seen basically for all time travelers in all the films. The advantage that you get as a time traveler is that you can enter a situation with extra knowledge, foreknowledge, and it gives you the ability to get the upper hand on a situation. And that's basically how time travelers work in films, or how they aim to work if they're trying to do something in particular. And then when you bring that into a romantic situation, it can never really be good, because you shouldn't be approaching a romantic situation trying to get the upper hand or have foreknowledge or something like that. You're tricking someone if you're doing that as a time traveler, and that's what makes it always feel wrong, because there's an issue of consent, isn't there? You're trying to achieve something and get something over on someone, which is not a good thing to do with a romantic partner.
Which is obviously why all of these sort of like time travel romance stories are falling flat, because they've got that kind of like stalkery element to them, don't they?
Yeah, exactly. Which is what makes them so creepy. But do you know what I do want to say though? Putting all of that to one side, and I think that I'm a little bit desensitized to all the time travel creepiness, because we've seen so many like weird relationships. Putting all of that aside, I actually thought this film was better than I expected it to be. I knew that was the fundamental premise, that we were going to watch a romance film where the guy goes back in time to when she's a little girl, because it's in the trailer. So I guess going in and just knowing that was all going to be creepy, I was actually able to put it to one side a little bit. And there was stuff that I did quite enjoy about their relationship when they're older, and some of the stuff that goes on between them was quite interesting, particularly when she gets pregnant, when Claire gets pregnant. So they have a big argument. He goes and has a vasectomy. They have another big argument, and then she sleeps with a younger version of him and gets pregnant by the younger version of him. I just thought that was like a nice little moment of, that was a pretty awful thing that she did as well. So like it kind of turned the tables, because getting pregnant, sort of tricking your partner into getting you pregnant is a pretty awful thing to do. And I didn't think that was good of Claire at all. I thought that was really bad of Claire to do that in the film. But I did quite enjoy just the sort of turning of the tables. Like, he's done this creepy thing. She's called him out for doing this creepy thing of, tricking a little girl into falling in love with him, basically. She completely calls him out on it, and then tricks the younger version into getting her pregnant against the older version's wishes. Like, because
he decided to have a vasectomy on his own, hadn't he? So they basically been having lots of problems trying to get pregnant, because the chrono impairment, I think is what they refer to it as. This is passed down through genetics. So his daughter or his son, whatever they're having at the different times in the storyline, the baby has that weird time travel ability, and it's almost as if the baby's time traveling through time whilst in Claire's belly. So it's like, I thought that was like a weird, it's quite an interesting concept that you've got a child time traveler that can't control their abilities. So they keep sort of disappearing out, and then that's what's causing the sort of miscarriages. What did you think about that element to it?
Yeah, they don't spell it out so graphically, do they? But it's heavily implied that that's what's happening, and sure, it's a really horrible, grisly thought, isn't it? That so what the baby is it just moving is it staying in the womb but like moving through time, or did it completely leave her body or something like that?
I think there's one moment where Henry says something like that. He implies that's what's happening when he's talking to the doctor. The doctor as well, interestingly. So the guy who plays him, he's in Groundhog Day as well.
Stephen Tobolowsky doing a fairly serious role in this, which was a bit strange.
But apparently he was cast solely because he was in Groundhog Day. So they wanted to get him in just because it's a time travel film. Let's throw this guy in, which I thought was quite funny.
God, that's just odd though, isn't it? That would have worked if they threw him in for like a comedy little cameo, like he is in Groundhog Day. But to throw him in as the doctor who's trying to like save the baby and save Henry is, I don't know, a strange. You don't want to be thinking of his role in Groundhog Day during those scenes.
Do you remember the night in the parking lot when I came to get you? You were younger, before the surgery. I mean, it's not like I cheated on you.
So yeah, so also when he sort of reveals that he's had a vasectomy to Claire, I think it's after he's had it, he disappears off and visits her when she's a teenager. I think she's 18. And that's when they have their first kiss.
Oh, yeah.
So I thought that was another weird bit, because that sort of like preempts the moment when Claire sleeps with the younger Henry. So he's sort of like, again, they're both finding like other lovers. They are the same person, but they're looking at like younger versions of them. And I thought that was like quite an interesting thing, because there's that whole thing when like couples get older, sometimes they think they're going to be looking for like younger partners, and this kind of element comes in there through that.
Yeah, again, it fitted nicely into the back and forth of the spat that they were having, and they were both doing these pretty unpleasant things, using the time travel to get one over on each other, or to to continue this argument, and also reach out to like a different version of their partner that they prefer. And it worked in that sense for me. But again, the Henry and young Claire side of it was still just really creepy, because he's a mid-30s Henry, and he just forcibly kisses an 18-year-old Claire. It's just really gross, isn't it? Like,
yeah, and she's like, "Oh, you shouldn't have done that." Like, and she's really taken aback, and that's like a horrible memory that present-day Claire obviously has. So it's like it's just really messy, isn't it?
Yeah, and then why does I don't know? Maybe I'm not giving enough credit to the friendship they had when she was a child, but she says that's the last time she saw him. I think until they meet in his timeline. I think that kiss was his last trip to young Claire. So why does this 18-year-old who's like the man who like met me in the bushes, my whole childhood life, and then tried to force himself on me when I was 18. God, I can't wait to meet him and fall in love with him. Why is that like, that's her like final memory of him from her childhood, is that she became an adult, a young adult, and he seemed to try and force himself on her. Super weird.
Yeah. It's not nice, is it?
That wasn't very nice. You've never kissed me before.
Yeah, it's strange that though, isn't it? Because like at moments, like you said before, even with all this creepy stuff that when you think about is like wrong, the film still sort of like makes you believe in their relationship. It's a really weird thing to do, but it's like you do believe that they like are in love and they have feelings for each other, and sort of like they should be together. And sort of like when they do get pregnant, that kind of brings them back together again, doesn't it? They've had the sort of like ups and downs and that kind of thing, and then suddenly they've got this baby which they're thinking about. And Henry's very sort of dubious about it to start off with, because he's sure that it's not going to work out. There's going to be some sort of problems. There's going to be a complication with it because of his ability.
And also that he's, at this point in his life, he's never been far enough into the future to see a child. So he's actually thinking like, well, we don't have a child. Anything we do try will fail because I've never seen us with a child. So he's worried about he's worried in a realistic way, like someone who has an illness might fear a genetic, if they, passing it on to your children. Sort of a believable performance from Eric Bana. And then coupled with that, he's also got this foreknowledge of a time traveler. He's been to the future and he's never seen a child. So he has legitimate reason to believe nothing's going to work, and is trying to dissuade Claire from going ahead with that. But like you said, they come back together. The pregnancy actually goes well. She carries its term and everything's okay, and that brings them back together as a couple.
And Henry's given that sort of like, he gets that future knowledge again so that he can feel more at ease about the whole thing, because he travels forward in time and gets to meet his daughter. So, and in that moment, he finds out that he's going to die, doesn't he? He's already seen, I think at that point, he's already seen the naked body like appear in his front room, and it's him, and he's been shot. So he kind of has that in the back of his head that something like that is going to happen. But he's given confirmation from his daughter, who says like, our mum's like, if we miss you and that kind of thing. And then he realizes at that point that he's not going to live to the point that she's that age.
Yeah, and she even tells him that you're going to die when I'm 5 years old.
Yeah, so he's given that knowledge of his death at that point, and he's got that sort of like hanging over him. And they even, Claire knows as well, because she's got an idea that something like that's going to happen, because she says, I've never seen you past this certain age. Like in all the times I've seen you in the past, I've never seen you past this age. So yes, they know something bad's going to happen. But throughout it all, they have their daughter, and then they have like 5 really happy years. They sort of like do it in a montage. You see her sort of like grow up. It's
actually a really cool montage as well. It's like a single shot that's moving through their house together, and then within that shot, it's the characters are kind of coming and going at different ages in their life, and you see like the decorations go up for a birthday party, and then the camera swings around, and she's getting like violin lessons from Henry's dad. It was definitely the most sort of visually interesting bit of the film. I really thought that was a cool technique to do like a montage within a single take.
And speaking of sort of like cool techniques and stuff, the way that they depicted his daughter's time travel, I thought was really cool, because she's got a grasp of it. She can sort of like, she says at some point that she can control it to a degree. She can go back to moments that she wants to. And she also talks to her future self, and they're sort of like mates. They have like play dates and stuff, and they're running around the garden. And I thought this was such an interesting idea, that in all the other films we've seen, whenever there's been doubles and things like that, we talked about it when we looked at Looper and Time Crimes, there's like a hate between the two of them, or like you shouldn't meet your future self. Whereas this, it gets rid of all that. And if anything, having your future self around can sort of help you deal with traumatic moments that are going to happen, and it can give you some sort of foresight. And I love that whole idea in this.
Yeah, I thought that was really cool too. Like you said, it normally brings about danger or conflict if characters come into contact with themselves from a different timeline. But yeah, it works really well in this film. They kind of introduce it at the start because Henry comforts himself as he's witnessing the crash that kills his mother. He comes back as an adult and comforts himself, even though the kid doesn't really understand it. And Alba, his daughter, does the same thing. Yeah, and I thought that was really good. I thought everything, like I said, I tried to just put aside the creepiness, and definitely in the second half of the film, that's when it got into some really interesting concepts, and everything with their daughter was really, really interesting because she had this sort of advanced ability. She's able to control it. She does these more interesting things, and it really, like, I don't know, it kind of built up a head of steam towards the end of the film that I was actually really enjoying. And it made me think of the butterfly effect in that, so the child has greater control of the time travel ability that's been passed on. That's what Evan has in the butterfly effect. And we talked about how it would be interesting to see the same story, but with Evan's dad, and see what happened there. That is basically what we're getting in a way from the time traveler's wife. We're seeing it from the father's side of the story, who's got less control over it. Sadly, it's not Callum Keith Rennie. It's another example where it would have been a better film with Callum Keith Rennie, but we are seeing that side of the story between the generations.
Yeah, and I thought it also had sort of like some comparisons with Slaughterhouse 5 as well, just in the fact that he's going back to certain moments which are important to his life, so he's always gravitating towards those bits. And again, it's like personal history, so he doesn't ever go back to like I don't know, the Wild West, as we will talk about shortly. But he'll stay in like specific moments which are sort of like key to him and the people that he knows and loves.
Yeah, Billy in Slaughterhouse 5 had a similar grasp of time travel. Like, he couldn't really control it, but there was obviously moments in time in his own history that he was drawn back to. And for him, it was this horrible, traumatic experience of the bombing of Dresden. And in this film, because obviously it's a lighter tone than that film, it's the moments that he comes back to are sort of significant emotional memories of his wife. So he's drawn back to those times.
Yeah, because this film is really trying to sort of like drive that emotional element through, and sort of it's tricky as well because it is called The Time Traveler's Wife, and it's about Claire, and it's about the sort of like difficulty in being in a relationship with someone who can't control where they're going to be at any given time. And that's sort of like the thing that hangs over Henry throughout the film, that he doesn't know when he's going to sort of like get into a situation that he can't get out of. And we've talked about the jeopardy that there is in his time travel, like the fact he's naked and he doesn't know where he's going to be. And this sort of like catches up with him towards the end, doesn't it? So he already knows there's going to be this moment where he's going to get shot. And sort of like the precursor to that is there's a moment where he loses, like, he gets hypothermia and can't walk or something.
I don't know. I totally didn't understand what was going on there. I don't know if I just wasn't concentrating, but it seemed like he just appeared in a wheelchair at some point. He was on some drugs to like, his condition was getting worse. I think it was just making him ill from the time travel. They give him some drugs for the pain, and then he ends up in a wheelchair.
I think what it was is he ended up on like a freight train or something, and he sort of like couldn't get any clothes and was just left there for ages. So something like that had happened. Yeah. It was like a really quick bit, and also like you're thinking about him getting properly shot at that point. But Claire brings up a good point that he has to be able to run and walk, because if he can't, then he's going to get into a situation where he's going to be naked, alone, in a potentially dangerous place, and there's no way for him to escape it. And that's sort of like what happens after that. So he says, like, whilst in the wheelchair, he's having lots of time travel moments. He's traveling more than he used to because he's like stressed, and he's sort of like feeling it more. And then there's the moment when he actually does get shot, and it's an emotional bit, isn't it? Because he knows it's coming on that particular day. I think it is on the 5th birthday, isn't it?
No, it's within her. It's when she's 5. So we have like a scene that is her 5th birthday, which is sort of sad for him because he knows what that means. But it's further down the line. I think it's I think it's 4th of July because there's a load of fireworks. So I thought he was going to get like shot with a firework or something, which would be a bit silly. But yeah, that's not how it happens, is it? But they are having a party, and yeah, he gets like the opportunity to like say goodbye to Gomez, his friend, and it's another interesting scene, I thought.
And he says to Claire, or Claire says, "Why did you get me to invite all these people?" And he says, "I didn't want you to be alone, like for this really traumatic thing that you're about to go through." And the fact he's already gone back in time at one point and he's seen himself dying from the window. So he's seen that exact moment. He's seen the bit. So he's had that hanging over him as well. So he's just seen it from every angle.
His own death in the back half of the film, his own death becomes the new moment with gravity for him. He appears to himself as a bleeding body earlier on. He goes forward and watches it through the window. It becomes the moment of focus for him. But it gives him this opportunity to plan ahead, like you said, and try and create a situation for Claire that's going to be as best as possible, even though something awful is going to happen.
And like, even though there's that really traumatic moment when he does pass away, and you sort of like feel that, like, as much as this film can be creepy with the certain elements going in it, I think you do sort of like, you get that emotional build up just because it's been hanging over you for that like last half of the film. You know it's going to happen, and it does happen. Part of you thinks like, oh, is he going to get out of it somehow? And the film gives you some sort of like light relief about that moment, because later on it's sort of like fast forwards of like a few more years, and Henry does get the chance to see Claire again, and Claire gets to see him sort of like just through one of his time travel moments. So he traveled forward in time, even though he's passed away in that present. So like that was like the Hollywood kind of resolution to it, to give you a bit more hope.
Yeah. I feel like it's a necessary ending, because although, I mean, this film's called The Time Traveler's Wife, and it's ostensibly about Claire's experience of being married to a time traveler. Like, I don't think she gets a sort of fair treatment in terms of being fleshed out as a character. We don't, there's these struggles that they have when they're first married, but like I said, that's just sort of brushed under the carpet because he wins $5 million for them. She doesn't get the opportunity to like really express all of that, I don't think, or have that resolved. So that happy ending feels kind of necessary, because I just don't think she's particularly fleshed out. So it just sort of feels like you do need to give her a bit of a happy ending where she gets to see her husband one last time and say goodbye after he dies, because otherwise it's just, she hasn't had a particularly interesting or fleshed out story, and then her husband dies. Like, that's just really sad. So it does feel really necessary that you just give her this happy epilogue. Yeah,
it is very sort of like, it's one-sided in its approach to the story itself, because it is very much focused on Henry's experience of time traveling. You do see moments of Claire, but it would have been quite interesting going from the other angle and then sort of seeing how it would have looked if it had all been centered around Claire predominantly. So instead of focusing on Henry's life and sort of like him sort of like going from having this really unhappy life with time travel to finding Claire and then sort of like building his life around her, to sort of like Claire's experience of it, seeing like having like this imaginary friend who suddenly like grows up and then she becomes like a love interest. It would have been quite interesting to see that, but that probably would have brought the creepy elements out more.
I don't know. Yeah, I feel like it should have done more of that to deliver on the promise of being titled The Time Traveler's Wife. I think we should have seen more of Claire when she's on her own, when he's disappeared, and how she's struggling and all that. I just don't think you see a great deal of that to really understand what's going on with her. And I don't know, I haven't read the book, but if the author was writing it to create a metaphor for her own relationships, I'm sure she would have put more into the wife character and the struggles that she was going through, you would think. So I don't think it really delivers on the premise of The Time Traveler's Wife. It's really just like the time traveling man who got married.
But I do think it's an interesting case study in looking at time travel romance films, because I think it's got all of the elements which we've seen as problematic, and it's put like them in a whole extra way as well by having that focus on the romance throughout. So the next film we're looking at, Back to the Future Part 3, also has a romantic spin in there as well. So shall we start talking about that?
So Back to the Future Part 3 from 1990 is the concluding part of the ultimate time travel trilogy. We had to cover it, and I think this is an interesting opportunity to talk about it, to talk about the love story that happens in the third film.
Yeah, definitely. And it's your favourite one, isn't it, Matt?
I really like it, and watching it again, I remember how much I liked it when I was a kid, and this is like my favourite Western film.
And you're a big Western fan though as well, aren't you?
I mean, I wasn't like when I was a kid. I did a lot of stuff on Westerns when I was at uni. So I've seen a lot of Westerns, and I probably haven't seen this film in a really long time. But going back to it and just realising that like it's a great Western movie. It's really fun. It's really good. It's a massive diversion from the last two films. But I think that that's absolutely necessary, because we looked at Back to the Future Part 2. It's really, really good, but it's really, really complicated. And you can't just keep making that story more and more complex. And then to just throw it all back to the Wild West and just go on like an adventure. I understand why some people might feel that that's just a big diversion. It doesn't feel the same as the other two films, but you got to get away from them. And you get to go on a big Wild West adventure to wrap up the story.
Also, I don't think it's that much of a diversion in terms of like the plot points and stuff, because it goes along the same sort of trajectory. All the same stuff happens. Marty goes to the saloon, like he's gone to the milkshake bar previously. You've got the Biff kind of character in there. You've got all of the things that kind of happen in the Back to the Future saga. But like you said, they've switched it up. They've given it that difference because they've gone even further into the past so that things are completely unrecognizable. You haven't got the sort of like the 50s element in there now. You haven't got this 80s stuff. You haven't got the future stuff. It's like it's so far removed. So it's like in the same way that when they went from the 80s to the future, things were completely different. They were completely modern. And they've stripped everything back by going back to, when is it, like the 1800s or something?
It's 1885, of course.
1885.
But yeah, you're right. It's they use the same roadmap, and particularly they're using the roadmap from the first film, which is Marty is going back in time. He's doing it deliberately this time, but that's not really important. He goes back in time, meets the Doc, who's not expecting to see him there, and then they have to work together to repair the time machine and get. They're trying to get them both back to the future, but get Marty back to the future. So they're using that same roadmap, and like you said, they're using the tropes that they've done throughout all the films, which is recurring characters at different stages, different generations, and seeing Hill Valley in a different time period. We've seen 30 years one way, 30 years another way, and now we've got 100 years back to do the Wild West and see all the same tropes and basically the same activities happening in Hill Valley.
But they keep it fun and they keep it interesting, and it's still really engaging in this film. And so they shot this straight after they shot part 2. So they went straight into production on this. I think Michael J. Fox had a bit of time off from the TV series he was working on. So they wanted to like make the most of that time he had off to try and film as much as they could, because that was the problem they ran into when they did Back to the Future. So Bob Gale and Robert Zemeckis sort of wanted to make this movie less focused on Marty's family this time around, because it's all been about Marty's story, hasn't it, previously? It's been about sort of like him going back and then sort of like making sure his mum and his dad get together and then making sure his kids are okay. So it's all about him. So in this one, they've switched the focus to Doc Brown, which I thought was really nice because they really tried to sort of flesh out his character a bit more. They did this in like simple ways, so it's not like overly sort of expositional. So they've kind of like, they do this at the start with talking about his past, and Doc Brown talks about how he loved Jules Verne books and stuff like that, and that's what got him into science. So they do that right off from the offset. They're sort of like, you're finding bits about his life. You go into his house in the 50s and you see what it was like before he started living in the garage in the 80s. So you see all of that, and you see more of him, don't you?
Yeah, he's the heart of the film, and Christopher Lloyd is still giving like 100% Christopher Lloyd, and he's very funny. But he does become a more rounded, three-dimensional character, and the main way that happens is through the romance in the film.
Exactly, and it's quite unexpected, isn't it? Because with Doc Brown, he's always just been Doc Brown on his own, him and Einstein, his dog, and then Marty will come in and have all the fun. But with this one, Marty's having to go back in time to help Doc Brown. Doc Brown kind of already has, like, he's already doing all right as a blacksmith, isn't he?
Yeah, and he's explicitly tried to tell Marty not to come back. He's not expecting to be rescued. He's made a life for himself, and he's becoming more of his own person and less of a wacky supporting character to Marty. I think it can feel a bit surprising the first time you watch it, but I think that that's because you experience the trilogy as a viewer through Marty's eyes. He's the same age as the target audience, and he's experienced things as the audience substitute. But what I noticed watching it this time, there was a really nice moment where the Doc is dancing with Clara, and Marty's like, the Doc can dance? Like, he's really surprised. Like, he's surprised that this guy's like got stuff to him that he didn't know about. But the Doc's like 60-something, 70-something. He's an old man, and Marty's a teenager still. He shouldn't be surprised that this old man that he's weirdly friends with has had a life before he met Marty. Yeah, he knows how to dance. Like, he was a young man once. You've seen him as a young man, and he was a bit of a crazy guy in the 50s. But, the Doc's had a life outside of his friendship with Marty, and there is more to him as a person. And it's coming out now because he's met someone and he's fallen in love.
And he takes the lead as well, doesn't he? So in terms of the moment when Marty's strung up by Buford and the Doc is the guy who comes and saves him. He's got his like built homemade sniper rifle and then shoots through the rope and sort of like saves his life. So he's already being portrayed as the hero character at the start. So he's gone from the moment where you see him in the 50s as being a bit sort of like bumbling and hitting his head in the bathroom, and he's just doesn't know what's going on, to the character that we know as Doc Brown being a bit more cool, calm and collected.
Yeah, he's really established himself in the Old West as a whole new character. And, he hinted at this in the second film. They foreshadow it by saying that it's a period in time that he'd really like to go to. He's really interested in it. He loves Westerns, all of that. And then you see that embodied in that he's successful and he's in control and he's like this sort of action hero. He's already got like a rivalry with Tannen that's pre-existing, that's going to kill him. He's not completely the super action hero. He's going to lose in a fight to Tannen almost immediately, but he's so confident. And I love that moment when he shows up with the modified rifle that's, like a sniper rifle. And I thought that was quite telling of the character as well, because what we're going to get into with the relationship stuff is the Doc's attitude to changing the timeline that he's always advising Marty not to do. But if he's in 1885 and he's creating these high-tech sniper rifles, he's already doing a little bit of that, isn't he? Like his blacksmith role in town, he's obviously using his scientific knowledge to create things that probably shouldn't exist in 1885. We see the gun, but what else could there be? And what changes is that going to cause to the timeline? Just him being there and doing that.
I mean, he creates that massive construction, which turns out to be like just an ice cube maker.
Yeah.
So he's already doing stuff that's a little bit suspect. But his whole reaction to sort of like the idea that he might be falling in love with someone is quite interesting as well, because so Marty already has the knowledge that Doc's headstone is going to read something like missed by his beloved Clara. So he knows that Doc's going to meet someone called Clara and then they're going to have some sort of relationship there. And the Doc straight like just dismisses this. He's like, Me in a romantic relationship, no, I'm dedicated to science. That's just me. I'm just a workhorse. That's what I do.
But is it that, or is it more the fact that it's a 1 week's time? So he just can't imagine that he could possibly meet someone and within a week they would be that, bereaved of his loss, and that she would be his beloved and all of that. And Marty's saying that Marty's basically saying it could be love at first sight. So they have that whole conversation about this idea of love at first sight. That's what the doc's completely dismissive of. He doesn't believe that's possible, and he just like writes it off. But of course, that's exactly what happens when he finally does meet Clara. They have this moment where they just, they're both at a loss for words, and he's like, "Oh, Clara, what a beautiful name." That's him having to deal with like he does now believe in love at first sight because of how he feels when he meets Clara.
Emmett Brown at your service, Miss.
Clayton. Clara Clayton.
Clara. What a beautiful name.
Yeah, and they treat that romance element there in such sort of like a traditionally nice, safe way, don't they? Like, there's nothing suspect about that. They're just two characters that are meeting, and they're meeting for the first time, and then there's a connection there. And they sort of like, they do over-egg it, but this is a family film. It's like, you're allowed to do that. You can sort of like just have two characters meet and then they fall in love. And that's sort of like the ideal kind of relationship. And that's it. And that's what happens. And then it's like, and then as you see them sort of like get to know each other, they're sort of like shy around each other as well. There's sort of like that element to it. And they're both sort of like, they're definitely infatuated with each other. And Marty sees that straight away. And it's kind of like how they develop that in the film. And it is like the driving force behind Doc's motives, because at one point he goes, he decides like, I can't go back to the future. I'm going to stay here. I'm going to stay here with Clara.
Yeah. And that leads to a nice moment where Marty gets to take on the like responsible time traveler role and remind Doc that like, no, you can't do that because that's, bad for the timeline. You're always telling me that we can't do this. Like, I thought it was handled quite well because Marty doesn't fully go into a lecture about that. His actual focus there is, no, you have to come back to the future because you're going to die in a week. Like, he's still fixated on the sort of the here and now and dealing with the problem, and he's worried about the Doc's safety. But it does also lead the Doc into having that kind of conversation with himself, saying like, yeah, okay, if roles were reversed, I would be cautioning you against messing with the space-time continuum, so I have to heed my own advice. And that he talks himself out of it in the end, but Marty's kind of nudged him in the right direction and been the responsible one.
Yeah, it's interesting to see, because Marty really does take on more of a responsible role in this as well, doesn't he? He's completely changes by the end of it, but we'll go into that in a little while. But how do they make, I was sort of trying to think, how do they make it so that this relationship between Doc Brown and Clara is okay and it's fine? Like, obviously they've sort of like made it more wholesome and appealing in that way, but you've still got a guy from the future sort of like meeting someone from the past and falling in love. So how do they make that okay in this?
So I think for the most part, the Doc doesn't do what creepy time travelers do, which is try and gain the upper hand in the relationship. I think for the most part, the Doc is quite honest with Clara. They have this like romantic conversation where they're looking at the moon through her telescope, and she's like, "Do you think we'll ever go there?" And he says, "Yes, we'll go in rocket ships." And he's telling the truth, but he's sort of accidentally quoting Jules Verne from a Jules Verne novel. So that leads them into this like sweet conversation about a shared interest, which is, that's romantic and that's nice. But the Doc is also just telling her the truth. Like, yeah, we will go to the moon on rockets. Like, he's being honest with her. He withholds the fact that he's from the future because he's still committed to this sort of, protecting the timeline and people can't know and all of that, but it's not done in a malicious way. I think that's what makes it work for the Doc as a remaining a likable love interest.
Yeah, and that's just reminded me as well. So, there's that one moment when Doc Brown says about his family. So they're in the 50s, and Doc Brown is saying like, "Oh, my family's became the Von Browns," and that's got a direct reference as well, apparently. So I think we talked about it when we did our space series, and we were looking at Woman in the Moon, and there were a few rocket scientists which were advisors on that film for Fritz Lang. And Werner von Braun is a very famous rocket scientist. So I think it's almost implied that Doc Brown's family were the first rocket scientists.
Yeah.
So I thought that was like another weird, like, interesting kind of element to just sneak in there.
It's a nice reference, yeah. And it also clarifies a question that I had when we looked at the first one or the second one, which was, is the Doc going to become his own grandfather? And that's the Brown fortune that he's squandered as a scientist. But that's not what happens. His family is coming from Germany in the early 1900s. So it's all good there.
Luckily, because that could have been really messy with all the time travel stuff.
The Browns didn't come to Hill Valley until 1908, and then they were the Von Brauns. My father changed our name during the First World War. Doc, look.
But yeah, they bond over this love of Jules Verne. That was kind of like the least sort of nice, wholesome moment for me, because they have a moment where right before they kiss for the first time, the Doc says, "Oh, I've never met a woman who likes Jules Verne." And she just goes, "I've never met a man like you." And I just thought like, oh, is that all he likes about her? She's just a woman who likes Jules Verne. Like, if you just went, if he was a little bit younger and could have gone on a dating website, he could have just put that on his profile and he wouldn't have been single until his like 70s, like, if that's his only criteria.
That's the other thing I was thinking about as well, like the age thing, is because obviously he's had that procedure to look younger, hasn't he? So like they look the same age in this, but really he's like a much older man. I mean, I think it's fine in the world of the film for this, but I did sort of like have that in the back of my head as well.
Yeah, good point. Like Christopher Lloyd's quite a bit older than Mary Steenbergen, I think. Yeah, so how old's he supposed to look then? He's had his weird surgery. What's he supposed to look like? 1955, Doc? Is that like the age that he's sort of supposed to be? So like 40s? Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, that's, he's a good bit older than Mary Steenbergen, but I think they're both old enough that it's not weird. It's not like Henry and Claire in The Time Traveler's Wife, the age difference, like, because she's plenty old enough to, meet a slightly older man and it's okay.
Also, Mary Steenbergen, she's like another one of these actresses which has been a time traveler before. So she was in Time After Time, which was in 1979. So before this. And in that, she's got like, I think H.G. Wells is her love interest. I haven't seen the film, but I did a little bit of reading about it. And that's the one where H.G. Wells is trying to chase down Jack the Ripper through time. But again, it's like you see these actresses which end up in time travel films. And I don't know whether it's because they're like, they go, "Oh, I've been in a time travel film before. I get it." So like, there's that kind of element to it. Or is it just like a crazy coincidence that they always end up in these like time travel movies?
I think it's just a coincidence, but what I do think is interesting is that so few of the films that we've looked at this series have had women as time travelers. I think Emily Blunt in Edge of Tomorrow is like an interesting example of like a action heroine in a time travel film, but she's not actually the time traveler of that film. She's done it before. We saw The Girl Who Leapt Through Time, so we've had like a female protagonist there, but for the most part, we don't get a lot of women traveling through time. They tend to be the long-suffering wives of time travelers, like Rachel McAdams in The Time Traveler's Wife.
Or the case of Predestination with Sarah Snook.
Yeah, and that's another really great example of it, but they are few and far between, sadly.
Emmett, when my bags were thrown from the wagon, my telescope was damaged. And since you mentioned an interest in science, I thought you might be able to repair it for me. I would pay you, of course.
No. I wouldn't think of charging you for this.
Obviously, Doc Brown and Clara's relationship is the main sort of love story thing that you see in this. But there's also Seamus McFly and his wife in this, Maggie McFly. So they're showing Marty a kind of like a family life and a love story there in terms of sort of like a long-lasting relationship. So that's quite an interesting thing to put in there as well, because that's kind of like putting it into Marty's head, how this sort of like family thing should be. Do you think there's sort of like something in that as well with this film?
Yeah, I think it's important for Marty's character development that he's got to see like a sweet, wholesome McFly family. Although, I mean, he's seen that in the first film, kind of, when he manages to get his family back together the way that he wants it to be. But he does see this, just that, you know, it can be nice, you can settle down, you can just be happy, and importantly, not be reckless getting into fights with anyone who calls you a coward, because Martin McFly, Seamus's brother, died from that kind of behavior. So he's got to see that world, and that's going to help him become the man that Jennifer needs at the end of the film, who's not going to get into the silly accident because of a race because he gets challenged.
Yeah, because we've constantly been talking about how Marty is a bit of a sort of like a live wire. He will fly off the handle, and that's been sort of like his thing throughout the entire series of the films. And they've turned it into sort of like something which may not be, well, it isn't a positive by the end of it. Like they kind of play it as something like, which is a fun part of his character in the first film. But as these films have developed, you're suddenly starting to get to see Marty grow as a character more. And it's by this third film and all of his like time traveling hijinks that he's learning his lesson about things. He's kind of like, this film is it's all about sort of like looking to the future rather than just being sort of like set in the present the whole time, in the moment. So all the characters are thinking about what can happen in the future. I mean, Doc is kind of like switching his way of thinking, because he's always been thinking about what could happen next and what couldn't happen and so on and so forth. Whereas Marty's always been in the moment. So it's kind of like you see the reverse of the roles there, because Doc Brown is learning to enjoy the present and enjoy his time with Clara and sort of like live, whereas Marty's gaining sort of like the sort of like experience to look forward and think things through a little bit more.
Yeah, he really becomes a much more mature character by the end of the film, and it's really a satisfying ending for Marty's story. And I said when we watched part 2 how much I was enjoying Michael J. Fox's performance in the second one, because it's an incredible comedy performance in the second one. He plays Marty McFly Jr., and you really see how good he is at bringing out like a different side to Marty McFly, the kind of pathetic, weak side to Marty's cool side. And that's really good, and it was really good for him as an actor, but it's essentially a comedy performance. In this third film, he's got to do all that maturing. He's got to be the voice of reason, trying to save the Doc and bring him back to the future. You just see this side of Michael J. Fox as this more mature character that I really, really enjoyed and had never noticed before watching this film, and it's really satisfying. And it means that ending with Jennifer in the car and the race, which feels a little bit tacked on, to the Western adventure, it works because it's so satisfying for Marty's character to have that ending. Like, I thought it was going to be a bit wackier and there'd be more of the comedy with Seamus McFly, but I was actually quite surprised to see that Seamus is not like a big comedic character in this film the same way that Marty Jr. is in the second film. He's actually just he's quite wise. He's like the voice of reason to Marty, like I said, saying about his brother and all of that. I thought there'd be more wackiness with the Wild West McFlys, you know.
Originally, I think Crispin Glover was going to play that role, but obviously there were all the issues with that. So that might have made more sense as to why he's written like that. But I do like the fact that it is Michael J. Fox playing him, and he's like showing a character that he could be more like if he changed a few things about himself.
Yeah, it would have worked well with Crispin Glover as well. There was a little bit of weirdness with having Michael J. Fox and Leah Thompson as that couple, because it kind of like reminds you of all the weirdness in the first film. But yeah, it works because of the role that Seamus is playing. But yeah, it would have worked just as well for those words of wisdom to have come from a man who looks just like his father. But it works the same, that the stuff that went on behind the scenes that couldn't allow for that to happen. It works the same for Michael J. Fox to do it. And it's just a really great performance. I read that I thought that he looked so much older in this film as well, Michael J. Fox. He would have been very young when the first one was made, and he is showing the age, even though that no time is basically supposed to have passed. But also I read that his father died and he'd had his first child in between the making of, I guess, the first and second film, or during the production of the second and third one. But I don't know if there's anything about that kind of life experience for an actor that brings more maturity, or am I not giving him enough credit just as an actor to be able to show that in his performance?
No, I think all of that stuff must play a role in how you sort of like play these characters as well. And I think all of that sort of like, he's done a lot of growing up in his personal life, which he's also bringing to this role, I feel.
Yeah. Yeah, there's more emotion, I think, in this film than in the other films. And it's the same with the Doc as well. So for Marty, it's this need to mature and become a grown-up by the end of the trilogy. And for the Doc, it's just, falling in love allows him to become a complete 3D, fully realized character and become more human. They both become more human, I think.
And it's interesting seeing, sort of like looking back at the moment when the Doc meets Clara for the first time and he's saving her life, isn't he? And then there's like the big moment at the end where he's again sort of saving her and helping her. So he's seen as this sort of like this hero character again. But also at the same time, it's like she's chasing after him and then he was chasing after her previously. So it's this sort of like they're seen as equals more, which I think is part of the film and part of the reason the romance level works on it, because Clara is intelligent. She knows what's going on. She knows about astronomy. She's like a teacher. She's well read. She's got all of these things going on. And obviously we know the Doc's sort of like very intelligent. He's a scientist. So they're on the level. They're sort of like, they're equals. They're not shown as characters which are lacking. And I think that's part of the reason why the relationship works, because they're equal, aren't they?
I think so. I think she's got a lot more agency than a lot of romantic interests tend to have. Certainly more than we saw in Claire in The Time Traveler's Wife. Like you said, she pursues him at the end of the film. She figures out what's going on, even though she'd been told, but she didn't believe it. But she figures out that the time machine's real. And then she goes and tracks him down. She sticks up for him when Buford's threatening to shoot him, and she kicks him in the shin, this terrifying, outlaw of the West. She's not afraid of him. She's got that agency, and she's a more active character, I think, than women often get to be when they're a romantic interest in a film.
Yeah, and I think that's what you need, obviously, to make it work with any sort of romance in any sort of film. You've got to have characters which are equally fleshed out in order to make that a believable relationship.
And from a time travel perspective, what they do is she's got this agency and she's active, but she's got this sadness to her and a loneliness to her as well, which from a time travel perspective, it makes it kind of feel safe and okay and not wrong to ultimately pluck her out of her timeline, and she gets to become a time traveler with Doc because we've seen her as an equal to the Doc. That doesn't feel like a wrong thing to do for a time traveler, which it could feel like in another time travel film, plucking someone out of their timeline. She seems to be doing it of her own free will.
And that sort of like that sadness and not sort of belonging, I think that comes down to, again, the fact that she shouldn't be alive, should she? Because she's supposed to have died in that canyon. So she is a bit sort of like out of time. So it makes sense that the Doc is able to pluck her out of there because he saved her life. It's no longer called Clayton Canyon or whatever it's called. It ends up being called Eastwood Canyon because Marty ends up flying in there in the DeLorean. So it's nice to see. Yeah, that kind of helps the time travel element to it as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it makes her a more suitable time traveler. We've talked about other time travelers who feel like they don't belong in their own time. And even before she was, fated to die, she was still someone who loved sci-fi and loved gazing up at the moon and wondering about, will we ever go there? That's time traveler mentality that we've seen in other time travelers. So overall, it feels like a much more wholesome and nice romance that wraps up this trilogy. And I think it's a really good example of a love story in time travel, whereas I'm not so sold on The Time Traveler's Wife as a love story.
Yeah, that one's got a few more problematic elements, but it is sort of, I didn't think we'd be able to find one, but I think we found the closest nice romance that works in a time travel film with this film.
Yeah, it's such a tricky subject to have in time travel, and it causes so many problems that makes it quite icky to watch on screen. And I was really pleased to rewatch Back to the Future 3 and see that they've handled it quite well, and that it's quite a nice send-off for the perfect time travel trilogy.
And speaking of send-offs and ends to like trilogies and film series, next week we will be looking at fictional universes using time travel. So we're going to be taking on the monster that is Avengers Endgame. So that's going to be a really big one to chat about. And we're also going to be talking about X-Men Days of Future Past. So both films where they're taking the wealth of knowledge from their franchises and then using time travel to kind of explore them and, yeah, create really entertaining cinema.
Yeah, really excited about watching both these films. Loved them both when I saw them the first time. So that's going to be really fun to look back on.
In the meantime, if you want to get in touch with us, you can find us on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, anything else. I don't know if there's any other social media platforms. If there are, we haven't found them yet. We've got a website, journeythroughsci-fi.com. Yeah, come and find us, come and chat. We'd love to hear from you.
Join our discussion group on Facebook, or you can leave us a review. That would also be much appreciated. But until then, join us next time.